I'm Doug Edwards from the Special Programs Department of the Academy Foundation. I'm glad to see you here this evening, along with some of the most illustrious figures in the world of animation. Wolfgang Reitherman, Chuck Jones, a number of other people. We're here this evening to salute a legendary figure. And there are lots of legendary figures that we deal with from time to time in these programs, but tonight's subject, honoree, is a little bit different. There are very few legendary figures that you can really, without indulging in hyperbole, say have created one of the great cultural icons of our century, namely Betty Boop. Now, Betty Boop is an interesting cultural icon because not only is she a cultural icon and a sex figure, but she's a sex figure that started out as a dog. Now that in itself is unique. And how someone could take a little dog and turn it into one of the great sex objects of our times, well, we don't need to dwell on that. But anyway, we are here, of course, to pay tribute to Grim Natwick, who is one of the great pioneers in the field of motion picture animation and has been a contributor to some of the great works that we've all grown up with and learned to appreciate at an early age and have continued to appreciate on up to the very present. He's with us this evening and is going to be sharing some of his thoughts and memories, and with our host and guide, as usual, for animation programs, our ongoing consultant and champion of the medium of animated film, Mr. Charles Solomon. Charles?
Thank you. Grim Natwick is a member of the same generation of the real pioneers of animation in this country, that is Winsor McCay and Otto Messmer. But his career really begins with the second generation. He didn't make the very early experimental films, but rather came into the medium 60 years ago in 1923 when he began working at Hearst International. Now, at that point, animation was in a situation similar to what it is today with Saturday morning. The stuff being produced was largely standard, uninteresting, badly made films involving characters taken from other media, particularly comic strips. And it's no wonder that he left after a year and a half or so and went to Europe to study art further. When he returned in 1928, the year of Steamboat Willie, that situation was beginning to change. Animation was more popular than ever, and Winsor McCay's vision of it as an art form rather than a simple entertainment was beginning to be realized by a few people, particularly Walt Disney. And Grim was one of the people who helped to make that transition from a sloppily made string of gags called a cartoon to animation as a real art form and medium of expression in America. Betty Boop was the first truly feminine cartoon character that we had seen in this country. There had been a lot of male characters, and there had been a lot of sort of females who were essentially male characters with long eyelashes and wearing dresses. That's different from making a character move and act and even think as a female personality. And that's what Grim contributed so much to. That came not only out of an innate talent, but also a knowledge of anatomy and just how to draw acquired in his years of study in Vienna. Betty was an immediate hit, of course. She was almost as popular when she came out as she is today. And Grim continued to explore this idea of the feminine character and expressing a really female animated figure in his work at Walt Disney, where he worked on Snow White, of course. Now, he did many female characters, but as you'll see from these films, his work was not limited to them. his work and the man remain a monument to animation. Two caveats. On the early films, you may or may not see his name on the credits. This is because in those days, say at Fleischer's, they would go around as they were finishing a film and saying, "Who hasn't been on a picture in a while?" and then put those names on as animators or directors. Nonetheless, these are the films he worked on. Also, we have two messages to read, one from Seamus Culhane, an animator who now lives in New York, and is best known for animating the dwarves marching in singing Hi-Ho in Snow White, who says, "I agree with you. It took a long time for the people in the industry to realize that they were working with a genuine eccentric and one of the best animators who ever pushed a pencil." He goes on to pay tribute to Grimm's skill not only as an artist and an animator, but as a pool player, horseshoe player, and beer drinker. And concludes that he is very pleased with his new role as the industry's father figure. The other message we have is, "Dear Grimm, a million thanks for creating Betty Boop, the first animated American sexpot, round-eyed, dimpled knees, pursing her rosebud mouth to sing boop-boop-a-doop. Thanks to you, Grimm, I lived the part, walked and talked like her. I never stopped. How wonderful to know that in this world where everything changes, one thing remains constant. Grimm Natwick. So sorry I can't be with you tonight, but happy that the Motion Picture Academy is honoring you. My love always, boop boop a doop, Make Westell," the voice of Betty Boop. And at the last moment, we have a note from Walter Lantz, the creator of Woody Woodpecker. Having known Grimm Natwick for 60 years, I guess we are the oldest living legends in the animated cartoon field. We both learned the art of animation at the Hearst Cosmopolitan Studios in New York City under the direction of Gregory LaCava, who was selected by Mr. Hearst because he had some experience in animation at Mutt and Jeff. Grimm was a very talented and successful illustrator and cover artist, but he was interested in the art of animation, so he asked his friend LaCava if he would give him a job. Well, LaCava knew Grimm was a brilliant artist and would not have any problem learning how to animate. I was only 18 years old when LaCava said to Grimm, "If this kid can animate, you surely can." All of the animators had great respect for his talent and did everything possible to teach him. It was not too long before Grimm could animate better than any of us. We only animated the characters that appeared in the Hearst papers: Happy Hooligan, Cats and Jammer Kids, Crazy Cat, Bringing Up Father. If a character left the scene, he would walk out left or right. Grimm was soon walking characters in perspective and turning them around and making them act. We all owe Grimm Natwick a lot for his artistic contribution to the art of animation. The two cartoons we're showing will demonstrate Grimm's clever animation. God bless you, Grimm, Gracie, and Walter Lantz. And now before we begin the films, we'll have a few words from the man who was the assistant to Grimm when he first came to California in 1931, himself one of the more redoubtable figures in American animation, the three-time Oscar winner, Chuck Jones.
At long last, the Academy has gotten around to scraping the top of the barrel. Somebody else is in charge of the kudos. They've asked me to come up and talk about the soft underbelly of Grimm Natwick. I know he created a great many female characters and devised a great many because he dated my sister. And we had quite a problem there because a lot of things that are now legal were not legal then, and I thought he was too old for that sort of thing in 1931, but I've waited 52 years to pay tribute to Grimm Natwick, one of the great draftsmen of our time, not only in animation. And Grimm, who taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that I couldn't draw my ass. I was Grimm's first assistant when he, Al Eugster, Bernie Wolfe, Jimmy, later Seamus Culhane, came out from New York to join Up Iwerks. Actually, I was an in-betweener. The elegant term assistant only came along later. And one time, Al Bioworks, in a fit of frenzy trying to get some in-betweeners, advertised in the newspaper for some in-betweeners. And the phone rang, and his voice answered and said, "I understand you're looking for some go-betweens." This happened. When they get out here, they were all dressed like New York people. You know, they wore white shirts and ties and hats. Really, everybody wore hats. If you look at any of the old pictures of the studios in New York, you'll see that everybody wore hats, even when they were working. And this is all right for Little John, but not for... At any rate, all the boys out here, Ben Clopton and Tex Avery and so on, decided that Grimm was sartorially inept. And so there was a tailor up on Hollywood Boulevard named, I think it was called McIntyre's. And in those days, people wore very wide shoulders. So they took Grimm up there and had him fitted in one of the Hollywood suits, which at that time wore big wide lapels and big wide shoulders. Well, Grimm is now and always has been rather heavily endowed on the shoulders. So they picked out a very heavy, sort of a tangerine-colored cloth with orange stripes in it, and well padded at the shoulders. And when he came to work the first day, he looked like nothing so much as a plaid battleship. He had to go sideways through the door. And then somebody decided that Grimm needed an automobile, and they found something for him. I don't remember what make it was. He probably does. But it was Mack Truck's effort to get into the sports car. There was 15 feet of hood and a little conning tower. And when Grimm in his new suit got in there wasn't room for anyone else. No, there actually wasn't even room for Grimm. And beside the problem that he had with his suit and with his automobile, he had me. Poor Grimm, he little knew what he was in for. I was a parlayed cell washer. Ub had made me into an in-betweener because I was a failure as a cell washer, a painter, and an inker. Failure had gone to my head. I thought I could draw. Then Grimm Natwick came along, whereupon even my glazed and youthful eye became aware of great drawing. Grimm had gone to art school in Vienna, perhaps to avoid the draft for the Spanish-American War, or maybe the Civil War, I don't know. But his superb drawing made even Flip the Frog into beautiful and elegant grace notes. But alas, it was no contest. For every drawing of Grimm's, there were 3 of mine. Once in a generous gesture, he left 17 in-betweens with a chart showing me what to do. Unfortunately, I got a hold of the wrong extreme. I think it was a bulldog, or maybe it was Betty Boop. And I took number 1 drawing, which is Flip the Frog, and I in-betweened the frog into a dog in 17 drawings. And Ub then took pity on Grimm and fired me. And somewhat later, I went to Warner's, or Leon Schlesinger's it was then, where business manager Ray Katz didn't know the difference between a frog and a dog, or indeed between a cell washer and a director. So I became a director. That's all that was left. But my short association with Grimm Natwick was probably the most valuable of my life. He taught me by example that I couldn't draw, but more important, he instilled in me a desire to learn how to draw. I think all I wanted to do then, indeed all I want to do now, is to draw as well as Grimm Natwick. There's been a certain amount of badinage about Grimm Natwick's age, as in jokes about when he was at Disney's, he was considered either too young or too old to be one of the 9 old men. And it's certainly true that Grimm is a man who none of us knew when he was chronologically young, yet a man who all of us today know and admire and try to emulate. And what a privilege that is. My personal feeling is that Grimm Natwick, like Merlin, is going through life backwards, so that he knows everything about what is going to happen and has no interest in what has happened. At some time when the youngest of us has gone to Forest Lawn, I believe that Grimm, with his brilliance and his beauty and his strength, will for the first time be trying on his first pair of diapers. Thank you.
That's going a long ways, Chuck. Oh, Christ's sake. Nice looking man up here.
Nice looking kids.
We're the young guys. What do you remember of working with these two gentlemen back in the old days? Not too old.
Well, Chuck said a lot about working with Chuck. I remember when this 18-year-old kid came in, and in those very early days, as you've seen some of the very early animation. Some of it's quite crude, but to save ourselves, the animators had a few tricks that they used to make animation look quite good, even when it wasn't. One of them was that we would, the animator would make the key positions, maybe 5 or 6 drawings apart, but we would use arcs, pencil-lined arcs, so that the assistant could follow the arcs, and it always looked kind of good, even though the thing really was not great. But Chuck had been a straight A student in high school, and he knew that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line. So he started going. Instead of following the nice arcs that I had laid out, he went straight across, up and down. Chuck created the first purely cubistic animation that was ever done in Hollywood. So I invited Chuck to go across the street where we split a strawberry ice cream soda. And I tried to explain to Chuck the difference between straight lines and curves, and I think you remember what I said about the curves. I'm not so sure about the straight lines. But he finally, as I have discovered, gone a very long ways. He went over to, I don't know whether he got disgusted with iWorks, but he did go to Warner's and became one of their great directors, and I have always, of course, had as much respect as you have for the marvelous things, and particularly the impact on timing and spacing in the Roadrunner and El Coyote and the other pictures he worked on. And Chuck didn't stop there. He went on under his own banner to do some great half-hour things. I'll never expect to go anywhere as near as far as he did in the development and creation of great animated cartoons. So I have terrific respect. I've been one of the luckiest people in the world. I've had assistants who really were, I don't dare say better than I was, kind of putting it down. But
They were younger than you. Anyway.
I always, about Marc Davis, I've always thought he was one of the greatest draftsmen that ever got in, and he was really in animation. If he'd been born back in the 14th century, he probably would have been an assistant to Raphael, or maybe Raphael would have been assisting him. Of course, Marc would have had to join the Catholic Church.
Well, if you'd been born in the 14th century like Grimm was, you'd be all right.
Mark, I remember the day Methuselah came in.
He was a teenager too, wasn't he?
Mark, what are your earliest recollections of working with Grimm on Snow White?
Well, I was so green and so new in the business, I had no idea what in the world I was doing. So I did pretty much what Grimm told me, which was to do what he said. I learned that from Grimm that wine not only came in a plain red bottle, as he knew, but there was also wine that could be white and had labels on it. I learned that. I also learned that you could take olives and green ripe olives, put them in olive oil with garlic and leave them there for a long time, and they tasted magnificent. And that was another thing I learned from Grimm. No, in a more serious vein though, I never have worked with anybody who had a greater respect for artists who did real good things around him. And I remember when I first went to work with him, his enthusiasm for a Bill Titla and for a Fred Moore. And I met those people through Grimm, and he would go, or I could later would go, and we'd collect some of their old roughs that were discards and admire these things. And the appreciation really and sensitivity to other people's work, I've never seen anything like this that I have seen with Grimm. And I also, I believe, began to look for other people. You know, this is a business where everybody kind of wonders who's stepping up behind you, but this was something never bothered Grimm at all. And I think for myself too, I never was greatly concerned about that because I appreciated the other people. And I think what really is the great thing with the business, the great thing with people like Grimm is that you know it, and Chuck, it takes a whole lot of people to make one of these films. And when you have these wonderful people that have magic, as Grimm has, as so many people in this business have had, this is the real magic. And I think this is the great thing of knowing Grimm. He introduced me to these people and gave me that same feeling.
I just want you to know, Clint, that when you say nice things about Natwick, you don't have to include me in.
Oh, I'm aware of that.
It's not necessary. I'm complimented enough to be sitting here.
Well, I put on a lot of weight I could really lean on.
There was one thing, though, that Grimm may or may not remember, but when these New York people came out here, they were sitting around in that apartment you had off Wilshire up here when an earthquake hit. Do you remember that? And a couple of people, the guys were sitting around, they told me afterward that they were sitting, they'd never been in an earthquake before, and they were too smashed to know they were in an earthquake. But there was a small statue of Flip the Frog up here, and they're sitting there drinking, and suddenly this statue went walked across the mantelpiece and fell off, and none of those New York animators drank for about a week.
That was at Ben Clopton's house. Remember Ben? Sure.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Yeah, I took a nice dive off the mantel right into the middle of the room, and about a 20th of a second later, we were all out in the front lawn.
And he means out.
We didn't wait for seconds.
A question to ask particularly you, Grimm, but if Chuck and Marc have any thoughts on it, we'd like to hear them also, is what do you see as contributing to the ongoing popularity of Betty Boop, as she's probably more popular today than she was in the 30s?
I certainly wondered about that myself. Yeah, of course, the fellows that worked with me, we all liked her, and I used to knock out. I've probably made 4,000 sketches, but I don't do that anymore, of Betty. But when you're working with a character, it doesn't matter if it's Mickey or Betty. It's like signing your name. You do the same character over so many times. Today now I spend 2 days trying to make one Betty. And there wasn't any innuendo in this. I apologize. I know that
Animation isn't just for kids, folks.
it's getting rather rotten when the audience is quicker than the speaker.
He's all
What was
for
the question?
Betty's popularity, but maybe better let it drop.
It is, I think that the Americans have always been slow to recognize real talent. That took them a half a century. No, there have always been. This is the third generation, and I think that everybody says the kids today are smarter than their parents. That may have something to do with it. But, no, the strange part of it is now in meetings, I've been in a few, not as large, or possibly as large as this, but it's amazing how many people know Betty. And I get at least, it used to be about once a week, I'd either get a phone call from New Jersey or somebody would write me from Alaska, and now it's about twice a week that I get some kind of an innuendo. I would hate to list, I've had 5 or 6 the past week, and one, this is not, well, I should say boasting, you know, I never boast, but I received one of these, a zodiacal map today. Somebody out in New Jersey has named 2 stars, the 2 twin stars, way off in the zodiac. One he calls Grim Natwick, and the other he calls Betty Boop. And a fellow phoned me only a few days ago and said that in the block where he lives, in a town back in the east, everybody in the block is insane about Betty, and they're thinking of naming the street Grim Natwick Way. Now that sounds fictitious, but it isn't. It's people are maniacs. Perhaps Betty feels she is a crazy little clown. She really is. I think, of course, the Hayes office was totally idiotic to ban her. I never saw a drawing in any of the cartoons. But, well, today, to ban Betty is, I don't know, there is no term to cover it.
No, for those of you who aren't aware, the Hayes office thought Betty Boop was too sexy, and she subsequently had to appear without her garter and in a much more modest sort of dress, just as they made the animators in Fantasia put the little bras on the centaurettes in the Pastoral Symphony.
Yeah, that was vulgar, that was immodest, that was immoral, and today a 4-year-old girl goes to bed with a 3-year-old boy in the first scene in the picture.
You know, Chuck and Marc, do you have any thoughts about Betty's popularity? Moving right along.
It was that damn garter that did it. It was, really.
Oh, the garter did it, yeah. Well, I shouldn't
Was that
blame
the top of her
her.
stocking or the middle of her leg? I mean, the garter. Was there stocking involved there? Or?
Well, did she have it? Yeah, she had, I guess the stockings were black, weren't they? No.
They weren't pantyhose, that's for sure.
Hey, Jackie Rocher, what color are her legs? What color?
I don't know, she wasn't
Well,
talking
they
about...
can, of course, today they can be any. Remember, Betty Boop was made during the black and white days. There was no color. They made one picture, I think, down in
Snow White.
What?
Betty Boop Snow White is the only color one.
I'm talking about Betty Boop.
Yeah.
Did I say Snow White?
But she appeared, no, Betty Boop as Snow White.
Oh. Well, no, what are you saying?
There's one color Betty Boop. Snow
Oh,
White.
was that Snow White?
Yes.
Well, I never saw it, but I heard it. But otherwise, she was black and white, and of course, color had come in, but it had not been perfected. And when it did come in, Walt Disney took a 2-year contract with Technicolor, so nobody could do things. That early, was it the
Jack Frost.
the Jack Frost picture was in color, but Cinecolor tried to do color, and Iworks left the studio and went down there and showed them how to do it. They couldn't make a cartoon print, and after a while, of course, Disney finally his contract expired, and everybody went into Technicolor.
Okay, what advice would you offer young animators, not just these fellows, but aspiring animators in the audience?
Well, they're not old.
Everything's relative. This is the time of relativity, isn't it?
I would, and I think Marc, I probably said this to Marc, learn to draw as well as you can and keep at it, and go to Europe if you can. I used the last penny I had to go over and study in Vienna for 3 years. And I was, at that moment, I had learned a little about animation and could have stayed right here in America and gotten rich. I mean, I've been worth $8,000 or $10,000 today. But I took the money I had saved and went to Vienna, and I did that under advice. It wasn't my idea, but a few American friends of mine who were artists had gone to Europe and said that $10 at that moment was like $100 over in Europe. And so I really got them into a corner and tried to make them verify it, and they did. So I quit. I was trying to pose. I'd rented a room. I was trying to pose models in New York. I'd saved a few $1,000, and it was too expensive. And so it just took me only 2 months to get packed up and get on a steamer. You could go to Europe for $80 in those days. And in Vienna, I'll try not to quote any figures, but I do remember one dinner I had in a sort of a fashionable outdoor restaurant overlooking the Danube River. Everything beautiful. The Indian town dated back to the 16th century. And we ordered a fresh trout dinner. I was married to a little 20-year-old girl who came from Wisconsin, my hometown, fortunately. And a bottle of wine and all of the grace that goes with serving a meal, and in American money it costs 25 cents. So you can just, I invited our landlady and her friend and a couple of other artists that I knew out to spend a summer. A few other American artists came over there, and one of them rented an apartment out overlooking the hills near Schönbrunn, a famous old castle. And the electric fare is something like 11. I felt ashamed of myself, but I made the best use of the few thousand I had. But it is the best thing that I would never have been able to have created Betty Boop. I never would have been able to animate Snow White, except that I added that 3 years of continuous life drawing and then going out in the summer and sketching. That would be my advice. Learn to draw as well as you can, and don't ever believe that you're good enough.
Okay, we'll take a few questions from the audience, if anyone has them for Grim or for Chuck and Marc. Lady in the front.
Yeah, I just wanted to have a curiosity about the Betty Boop song. Where did that come from? Or why did you choose for Boop you do?
Well, that was the most fortunate thing probably that happened to Betty Boop. There was a very famous popular singer in New York City at that time in the early 1930 to 31 when Betty came out. Her name was Helen Kane. Many of you may have heard her records, and she always, for innuendos, spots in the song that insinuated something that was perhaps a little off beat or off color. Instead of using words, she would say, "Oh, don't take my boop boop a doop away," and things like that. And so the songs were written for her. I suppose they took songs that were did not insinuate anything offbeat, but insinuated those words. And she had a voice that went very well with that. And of course, one big lawsuit followed it. Somebody claimed that boop 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 doop righted it because she was under contract with them. But the lawsuit ended in her favor, so apparently somebody else had used the term before and claimed that it had been stolen from her. But they found some old records where singers had used that little as they do today, with sometimes you hear nothing but a lot of vowels and consonants that don't mean anything.
It was Baby Esther, a black singer, was proven to have originated it before Helen Kane, and so Betty won her lawsuit. Other questions? Yo.
Went from a very cool character animation like stuff Disney to the highly stylized CGA. How did you manage that? What was it like?
When you going from the fuller animation of Disney and Disney particularly to the more stylized UPA
Oh,
stuff?
to
What was that
UPA,
transition?
yeah, I'm very sorry that they were, I believe, unable to get more. I love the work at UPA. I remember they had a crazy system there. Well, they thought it was an ideal. It was kind of a community feeling, the spirit at UPA. And Bozesto called me into his office. I had applied for a job. And he said, now, we use highly simplified animation here. And the stylized thing was supposed to be, it was new, of course. They did really innovate something there. And so I thought that it might be difficult the way he described it, but actually it was much easier animating there, and everybody liked it. You learned to like it very quickly. And I remember Ward Kimball coming over. He was crazy about the UPA animation. He said, I would come over here and work in a minute if I could afford to. But UPA was not, they were surviving at the end of a period of short 7-minute pictures in the theater. And the theaters continued to eliminate them until, well, you ran into that experience. Disney stopped. He was probably one of the first, and eventually the poor little short picture, which was one of the greatest entertainment creations in America, I think, just died a quiet death, and nobody could. UPA continued longer than anybody else. I love their pictures. I love to work on them.
Yes, by the way, the first UPA film was directed by Chuck, which was Hellbent for Election.
Oh, you nearly became a part of them, didn't you?
No, this was one we made at the start of the war, and it was called Hellbent for Election. It was actually to assist FDR to get elected. Everybody got paid, but when they got through, they had $125, so that's what I got for directing the picture.
Not bad.
We'll take.
I did that while I was still at Warner's. You know.
We'll take one last question. Gentleman back here. Any Gregory LaCava stories to share?
Well, that was when I got into animation. Greg LeCave, I used to call him George. We were going to the Chicago Art Institute at the same time. He came from Syracuse, New York, and I'd come down from Wisconsin, and we roomed in the same place and got very well acquainted. And after, I forget, we all had 2 or 3 jobs. We worked in cafeterias, and we'd just worked as supernumeraries in the theater and get $1 from each of them or something like that. Eventually, we both ran out of money, and he went back home, and I went back home, and somehow or other we maneuvered to get a little money together. So by that time, LeCave had gone into New York and had a comic strip. And animation came in. A Frenchman came over and introduced it into the Mutt and Jeff cartoons, and LeCave had worked, and being a very ambitious young Italian fellow and a very clever artist, he eventually talked himself into a job with the William Randolph Hearst studio. I, in the meantime, had stopped in Chicago and made about 200 song covers. They used to decorate the songs. People bought songs, took them home and sang them. And I saved a little money and went to New York, and so Greg finally said, "Why don't you get into this? It's great." I thought I was making pretty good money. I was making about $60 a week, which was a little better than the average salary in those days. And Greg told me that he was making $150 a week, which was unbelievable. You had to be vice president to earn that much. So we slept together in the same bed for a couple of months, and while I was searching for a room, and finally we had lunches together, and he said, "Come in and try it for a couple of weeks. I think you'll like it." And I tried it for a couple of weeks and did not like it, but he said, "Oh, you're doing great." The first scene I had, I don't know if you all know, most of you do know, the pan move, for a panorama move, which I knew nothing about. You might have a man on a galloping horse, and he's galloping in one position. You simply slide the drawings back, and they put peg holes at the top and move the background. They didn't do that. You had to gallop the animal all the way across. I couldn't make this thing. So all of a sudden I had an inspiration. I went over to the punch board and punched holes an eighth of an inch apart all the way across the thing. Then I traced drawing 1, and we only had 2 pegs in, and I took the drawing. Greg had animated the first action. He'd animated 1 step, and the Happy Hooligan had a big syringe, and he kept pumping narcotics into the horse so he could stand his feet. So I took drawing 1, and then drawing 2, I moved it that I had this extra peg hole moved around. I moved the drawing over and traced it. So I traced 120 drawings to get that horse across there. Now today you just make 8 repeat drawings and then slide them across in front of the background, or vice versa, slide the background behind the animal and keep the animal in one position. And boy, the perspiration filled my shoe tops almost. And I said, "I want to quit." And he said, "Don't do it." He said, "You're doing great." Well, strangely enough, on the next scene, I had a fisherman. I'd grown up in Wisconsin, and I knew what fishing was. It's a great fishing state. And Happy Hooligan had to throw a fish line over a transom in a hotel room, and he hooked a coat and a hat and a pair of pants, which he dressed himself up with. But that seemed natural, and sure enough, I felt what animation was.